Professor David Weiss, once again, from New Jersey City University's Institute for Dispute Resolution, and our flagship program, sponsored by Connecting Bridges and Borders as an outreach for global business, global affairs, and connecting the world. Today, we have a fascinating conversation on what I believe our listeners will be interested in hearing about, which is foreign capital flow into our New York City markets. Today, we have with us Fernando Koatz, who is with Gleason and Koatz, attorneys at law. They're located at the epicenter of what is happening and what will be happening, optimistically, back in New York City. Welcome to our show today, Fernando. How are you?
I'm fine. Thank you for having me.
So, Fernando, let's start off by letting our listeners know your amazing and extensive background in this space and what you do.
Well, thank you for the generous praise. My name again is Fernando Koatz. My law firm is Gleason Koatz. Most of my clients are foreign-based, mostly in Latin America and Western Europe because of my background. And for them, I engage in helping them with respect to purchases of residential property, as well as myriad commercial projects, everything from subscription agreements, operating agreements, to the actual purchase and sale, as well as of property, as well as financing, mostly on the borrower side, both hard money and institutional.
So that is a lot of interesting topics to cover, and we're going to try to break it down for our listeners. Because you certainly are practicing law both from the perspective of what we call bricks and mortars, and also from the lending side, which has a myriad of different stakeholder interests. So if we were to use the themes of those ideas, where were we before this COVID-19 experience and New York, both the good and the bad?
Well, with respect to New York, you always have to remember that New York has a lot of submarkets, divisions. So it depended where you were looking for. If you were looking for luxury condos to be sold briskly, there was a problem there because there was a surfeit of construction and availability of condos, and foreigners were shying away from that, which wasn't good. But there were a lot of opportunities, not only in Brooklyn, where Williamsburg was one of the key places, but in Queens as well as the Bronx. And I had clients come to me and say, I'm interested in a construction project. In other words, buying a piece of land or an existing building and rehabbing it, either for apartment rentals at market level or for condominiums. And the people would get involved with that. We'd set up the structure, and I didn't always identify the opportunity, but I would be retained at the point when they need a lawyer to assist them with respect to protecting their rights. And there are some complications involving foreigners, not so much in sending money to this country, although banks create problems with respect to wires from abroad, but also trying to protect them in terms of the corporate structure, with respect to possible lawsuits, estate actions, taxes, and so forth. So the good thing was there was always interest. The bad thing, if you will, was that certain markets had reached their limit and there weren't as much interest, if you will.
And if we're looking at the institutional side of things, whether it's the hard money or the capital market space or the traditional bank balance sector, where were they before this in terms of their appetite to finance these foreign investors' transactions?
Well, a lot of the transactions I was involved with, speaking anecdotally, were groups of foreigners who would pool their money together. And they would pool their money in agreements and structures, for example, in the form of portfolio loans, or setting up a subscription agreement, or has been set up for them to invest in. And that would put their money in there, and then they would begin the development. At some point, there would be a need for a bridge or construction loan. And along those lines, the institutions were a lot harder, at least the bigger ones. Chase, Bank of America, HSBC were not interested in lending. So they would go straight to hard money loans, or smaller banks like Spring Bank, I don't remember all their names, that were more willing, up to a certain amount, to finance these projects. And they weren't looking for the entire amount for a purchase or a sale or construction, just to help them along while they waited for additional funding down the road.
And as far as the business plan models before the COVID, what were most of these models? Were they acquisition to long-term hold investments, or were they developer transactions that would ultimately, after the development was done, be sold off or spun off into other entities? What did you find was the trend towards the what we'll call the beginning of this pandemic era, which was the closure of that new era, the old era that we were in?
Correct. Up until recently, let's say February, for example, beginning of March, I think you saw both kinds of investments. I saw a lot of construction development. In other words, they would buy either vacant land, which is hard to find in New York, but sometimes you can find it, or an existing building that they tear down or they would rehab. And then the whole point was either to do an apartment rental scheme at market value or luxury, or to sell off, to have condos that then sell off and then exit the investment. A lot of people like that from abroad because they're willing to put in the money for 2 or 3 years. Generally, these projects have that timeline, maybe up to 5 years, but they want an exit at some point. So depending on what the property was available, where they were looking. Now, a lot of these foreigners were always in touch with people here on the ground, so to speak, in the New York City area who had really understanding of the market, and they would really help them. And again, I would step in at the point that a lawyer was required to structure an agreement, to negotiate it, or to help with a contract that would eventually lead to a purchase or sale.
So let me ask you a question, because you raised the different reasons or rationales of why these particular types of foreign investors had appetites for investment in New York. And you talked about some of the tax reasons. I assume some of it may be also safe haven reasons. What on the tax side, again, I know it's a complicated conversation that could be its own show, but in a few sentences, could you explain to our listeners why one would be interested in that from a tax perspective as a foreign investor?
Well, taxes, as amazing it may seem to an American, are generally lower than abroad. We're less invasive and less acquisitive, if you will, especially the Congress with the Republican-controlled Congress in December 2017 came out with a plethora of laws that were really friendly in terms of capital gains and with respect to income tax and so forth. They created the opportunity zones as another form of investment, which only applied to funds already subject in the United States, subject to capital gains. And then there are some foreigners, and that's the other thing, a lot of foreigners already have money here and they're looking for new opportunities. It's not necessarily taking money out directly from their country, which happens a lot as well. But those tax benefits happen to be capital gains and so forth. And also with respect to the income tax, when they're actually making their money in the long run with respect to a rental. Now, you also mentioned, if I can go back to stability, as crazy as it may seem in our situation here in the States, and I'm talking before the pandemic, we had the whole thing with the impeachment and so forth. We are an island of stability, relatively speaking, with the rest of the world. Brexit, that's something people don't talk about anymore. It's going to create, I believe, some kind of chaos in the European Union. The Middle East, unfortunately, violent conflicts, problems in India, in China, in Japan, Latin America, always, unfortunately, unstable politically and economically. And these people, they're not trying to expatriate themselves, the ones with money, at least the ones I'm in touch with in Latin America, they just want to protect part of their assets, and you have stability here. The only bad thing is, and you asked what the good and the bad is, New York, unfortunately, is expensive, much more than Florida, South Florida, Texas, Arizona, and California, but it is much more stable. And the expenses that go into that make it a little more difficult for some people.
So you would say that in some cases, it's really a diversification of their asset portfolio.
Absolutely. In fact, I know, I tell the story because I speak a lot in webinars and classes to real estate brokers and so forth. One of my clients who came to me showed me a bottle that was similar to a Poland Spring water bottle. And he said his South American country was about 10%. Here's the one bottle. Up to here, that's all. And he doesn't expect it to be filled for several generations. So to protect his family, he said at that point, he had $10 million. Fernando, I want you to help me identify properties and investments because right now I'm not leaving where I am, but I want that 10 million to protect my family.
And within this sort of model, are they able to buy the real estate directly, or are they required by law to do something else?
No, the law doesn't require you to how you purchase it, but because of the estate tax, which is ruinous for non-resident aliens, in other words, someone who doesn't live in this country and is not a citizen, they always set up, or I set up a structure with an LLC owned by a blocker, which would be an offshore corporation or a trust, depending on the level of sophistication you want. That's because they only have a $60,000 exemption if they were to die owning these assets in this country. And that applies to stocks as well, but specifically real estate.
So the structure, as they always say, is very important to how you take your position in your investment. Is sort of the message we'll leave on that. Is that a correct statement?
Right, and not just the estate tax, also, and I'm a lawyer, it's liability. I'm not a litigator, but you're always going to have someone out there who's looking to file a lawsuit and you want to protect and segregate, if you will, your assets.
So one last question, and it's a little bit of a question that's for what we do within our institute. Do you find that you're using in these sorts of investment contracts, since they are out of the country, any sort of arbitration, mediation clauses that are built into some of the inter notes or inter agreements?
Well, generally, the operating agreements include arbitration clauses, and the arbitration, because most of these LLCs that use operating agreements are either based in Delaware or New York, half and half with respect to New York real estate, will have an arbitration clause which will be in New York. So subject to New York law. So yes, you do see that quite a bit. Not so much in the purchase and sale contracts. That tends to rely more on going to the courts themselves and applying New York law.
So when we look at where we are right now, if we transition from before the pandemic, what are you finding to be the challenges today?
Well, with respect to foreign investors, I think the challenges today are uncertainty. I know, and I've spoken to foreigners and their representatives who are looking for opportunities here in New York. They know that things will change, are going to be recast with respect to the New York real estate market. But there's uncertainty because a lot of people are on the sidelines. There's a lot of talk. There are a lot of things that they see now. Hotel industry is a disaster, a 10% capacity, I believe. There's a population exodus, unfortunately, from New York City. Retail is already a problem beforehand because people would buy into retail as well and properties that had retail. And there were all the issues now with hospitality as well as with restaurants. So the situation is uncertain and looks calamitous, but I really believe in the long run, there'll be opportunities here that someone can take advantage of if they have the funds.
So I guess my follow-up question would be, first, let's parcel out an A and B to this. So the A would be those with current legacy capital investments. What should they be concerned about? I mean, are we talking about the bankruptcies, insolvencies, or classic workouts that were similar to the 2008 credit crisis, or even further back to the 1988 Post-Tax Reform Act recession, where real estate, the largest transition of bricks and mortar real estate occurred in the United States, for our listeners. What do you see happening there? And then we'll talk about B in a minute, the question B.
I think the uncertainty derives more from the fact that you cannot have a valuation or an appraisal of these properties in the long run where you don't know what the cash flow will be in a lot of the commercial properties or residentials, because there are a lot of situations that have been created. Construction has been slowed. In New York, for example, no evictions are permitted until August. Nothing can begin, and it's likely to be extended by the governor. So you don't know, for example, if you want to have a building with a lot of residents who are paying market rates, what's going to happen if they haven't paid anything come September because of unemployment, which is horrible. The same thing with commercial. What is going to happen? So I think this situation is completely different from what was in the past. This is not a financial crisis the way it was in 2008, or it wasn't that similar to 1988, as you're referring to, or in 87 when that recession. It's more the fact that we can't determine. It's so hard. Lenders are really sitting on the sidelines. That's why there are opportunities for someone who has money already, not necessarily for a bridge loan or construction loan, but can go in and do the investments, or more likely pool their funds with other foreigners.
So let's talk about that, and let's talk about the near-term opportunities, which you already started to highlight a little bit in that last statement, but also the long-term opportunities. So let's talk first. Do you think there's going to be a lot of investors, both here and abroad, but I think mostly in the United States, thought that when the 2008 credit crisis took place, they were going to see this large opportunity like 1987, 88, where they were going to get their hands on bricks and mortar portfolios for heavy discounts. Instead, it wound up being heavy discounts on actual loan portfolios.
Right.
What do you see happening here in the future opportunity perspective, at least short term, and then we'll talk about the long term strategy as well.
Okay, in the short term, I think because the uncertainty is there and it's difficult to evaluate and appraise, there aren't that many opportunities. It's going to be more being in the right place at the right time, having information. And in fact, I always say, in real estate, talk about location, location, location. I think information is the same thing. It's key. I'm getting some information by my contacts with people in lending, with real estate brokers and so forth. There are opportunities out there, but they're not, it's not a wave that'll come crashing down onto here into New York saying, hey, now that it's open season, you can go in and swoop in. Because a lot of people aren't sure what they're going to do. They don't know whether to hang on or to let go. That's the near term. But there are opportunities. The long term, I believe there will be many more opportunities. There'll be a reset, a recast. It's going to take a while, 24 to 36 months. I don't think we're going to have a V-shaped recovery. I hope we do, but I don't see that. I think it's going to be more where it's going to be long term. There'll be issues whether there's a vaccine, how many people are going to come back into the city to feel comfortable. Restaurants cannot be at full capacity. It's 50%. That's going to affect all these things. There are repercussions of that, but it'll work out because I think, and this is more philosophical, moral, if you will, or historical, humans have a tendency to be sociable, and it'll come back. Maybe not looking exactly as it is now, but when it does come back, it'll be a great time to invest in New York because New York is always stable. I always tell people, and I do these kind of seminars when I go out in Portuguese in Brazil and in Spanish in Argentina, Mexico and Spain. I say, you have opportunities maybe, and I'm not putting down Florida, but Florida is a roller coaster of real estate. The same thing, California and Texas. New York, it goes up and down, but not to that extent. And if you're not necessarily looking for risk in order to have a huge return, because that's not really always the reason they come here to New York to invest. If you're looking for steady income and stability, this is the place, New York City. So we have problems. There are a lot of issues, serious issues that need to be addressed, and they will be over long term. What happens with subways? Oh, people are going to go to work. If these office buildings, people won't go in if they're too worried because there's no vaccine and we're going to have a situation that no one's going to show up. But we will take care of it. It'll be done eventually. So I am optimistic in the long term. I think there'll be great opportunities, and I want to be here to help because I also love this city as well.
Well, that's really important and very passionate. How you feel about this, and being where our university is located in Jersey City, across the pond, if you will, from New York City. In some cases, it's been looked at as part of the extension of New York. I think they called it at one point in the New York Times the sixth borough. But we are Jersey City and we're part of New Jersey, so we like to keep our identity. But you talk about this, we'll call it the lifestyle. Let's sort of finish on this part of it. And there's been a lot of debate and discussion now about people becoming, we'll call it even to this podcast series, the Zoom era, so that workplace and people's behaviors, including the workplace itself, realizing it can conduct a lot more business by utilizing and being acclimated to technology, means that there'll be less demand on the square footage, at least in the office building sector. And there was a great article recently about this, I believe in the New York Times, that was referencing what will happen to these ghost, if you will, skyscrapers if the behavior, as well as the bottom line, which is adapted to the pandemic, is a permanency. Where do you see that fitting into a metropolis like New York, which of course affects other metropolises like New York around the world?
Well, I'm more optimistic in that regard. I understand that JP Morgan and these big real estate brokerages are saying, well, we're not going to send all our people into these huge office buildings. It's expensive and we can still operate. Yes, that's true. But I think, again, once there's a vaccine, it's going to change because people will feel comfortable going into the city and doing the work. I really believe a lot of people, and I'm one of them, and I'm not objective here, I want to go back to my office. I find I'm more productive. I can do things like I am now in my home, and it's comfortable. In a certain way, I am a little more productive, but the ebb and flow and the give and take of being with people, I think that will come back. I think it's natural in human beings and human civilization. Again, I happen to love history, but if you go back in history, we started as hunter-gatherers and we had farms, and pretty soon there were cities in the ancient Near East. It's something that developed because it's something in human nature, in our genes, so to speak. And I think it will come back. It won't be exactly the same, but it's not going to be a ghost tower, ghost town, because partly the landlord's going to have to react to this, and the banks, because landlords, unfortunately, even if they want to be open and flexible, they have to pay back their lines of credit and mortgages and real estate taxes. They're responsible for that as well. They're going to have to be more flexible and probably come back down in their rents. It's not going to be a crash, if you will, but they'll come down. And I think we'll reach some kind of modus vivendi, and it'll be a balance, if you will, where everything will come together and it'll be, as much as we can, quote unquote, back to normal.
Well, that's a, I was going to end with that question I asked you, but you raise just both a mindfulness, passionate statement, and it's really important about human behavior. And for our audience, I think it's important to also see that one of the good things with this balance that this word you use, I think is important because one of the problems that a number of New Yorkers felt that they were getting priced out of the market. Those that were there every day were in good white collar jobs, but yet they still could not, even on the salaries that for the rest of the world, let alone the United States, seemed tremendous. They were still living paycheck to paycheck because of the amount that a one-bedroom apartment was costing, or the cost of the parking garage, or getting even a cup of coffee, which had to be passed on through the person that owned, or the entity that owned the retail space. Mm-hmm. So do you think one of the good things that may come out of this rebalancing and resetting is an ability for people to afford to live in New York again and have a vibrant city?
Absolutely, including Jersey City, the sixth borough, if you will. I think that, yes, there'll be, as I said, a recast or reset, and I think it'll be good in the long run for New York City.
Well, that's fantastic. Fernando, I want to really thank you for providing some really depth and a little bit of insight for our listeners around the world as far as what is happening in New York on the real estate side. I know it's a big topic of conversation for people. Those that already have investments and those that are seeking to try to figure out how to invest, and certainly sharing your decades of experience in this field, and your personal human insight into this, and continuing to be, please, optimistic about the great city of New York, which is unique, I think, city in the world to any other city that exists on the planet. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
On that note, I want to thank all of our listeners again for being part of this wonderful discussion today on the future of real estate, as well as foreign investors in New York City, and being optimistic here and for all of us around the world, as Fernando points out. I think it's very important that we all keep that in mind, that there will be a new day and a new light. So thank you. This is Professor Weiss signing off again for New Jersey City University's Institute for Dispute Resolution and its Connecting Bridges and Borders programming. Until next time, I bid adieu.